All right. So if you will allow me to just nerd out for a little bit, I want to share a theory with you that I have about hero stories. So yes, the 2+ question was preparation for the sermon. You didn't even realize it. Here's my theory. In every truly great hero story, there is something that I like to call the moment. This is the scene where that critical shift takes place in the narrative and everything changes. If you need some examples, I've got some for you. Think of the moment at the end of Avengers Endgame when an exhausted Captain America hears a staticky on your left. And then we see King T'Challa and Okoye and Shuri come through Doctor Strange's portal. Maybe you're not an Avengers person. Let me give you another one. Harry Potter, Deathly Hallows, Part 2. Neville slices through Nagini's neck with the sword of Godric Gryffindor. Or, for my true Star Wars fans out there, when in the final moments of The Rise of Skywalker, Rey passes Ben Solo a lightsaber when he's being kicked around by the Knights of Ren. Now, when these moments come during a movie, without fail, my heart rate goes through the roof. Because whenever the moment comes, you know that the battle is about to get real. Right? So like in Avengers, you've got the whole crew rolling up, and then Cap summons the hammer, and the whole theater goes nuts. In Deathly Hallows, the camera cuts to Voldemort, and you can see it in his eyes. He knows he's about to get clapped. And in The Rise of Skywalker, I know that there's a lot of controversy about how that movie ends, but you cannot tell me that when you saw that movie, you weren't on the edge of your seat when Ben pulls out that lightsaber and goes to town. And after the moment, the audience or the reader knows that the good guys are going to win and the bad guys are going to lose. Because the moment always reveals that the good guys have something that the bad guys just can't match. Now, the book of Exodus can be described in many ways, but I don't think I'm going too far to say that it is one of the Bible's greatest hero stories. I mean, you've got plagues and natural disasters, pillars of fire, mountains coursing with thunder and lightning. There's some truly cosmic stuff going on. And then we have our hero, Moses, who has a quintessential hero arc. He runs from his destiny until he's forced to confront it, and then he goes on a journey to free his people from bondage and lead them toward the land of promise. But you don't have to just take my word for it. The story of Moses, from humble beginnings to one of the greatest figures in the history of Israel, has been adapted by filmmakers multiple times. One of my personal favorites is the 1998 animated film, The Prince of Egypt. It won 12 film awards and was nominated for 27 more. If you haven't seen it, it's on Hulu. Go watch it. It's fantastic. Trust me, it is worth your time. If you're not into animated movies, in 2014, there's a movie called Exodus, Gods and Kings, that turned the story of Moses into a 2.5 epic story with special effects and stars like Christian Bale and Sigourney Weaver. Exodus is truly a hero story for the ages. And today, as we start our new sermon series, we begin basically right at the beginning of this grand story of Exodus. And already, just 2 chapters in, we are in desperate need of the moment. God's people, the people with whom God made an eternal covenant of prosperity and blessing, are enslaved, brutally enslaved, and suffering under the reign of a genocidal Pharaoh who has decreed that all of the baby Hebrew boys should die, lest they grow up into an army that would unseat him. But we have a pair of brave midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. They resist the king's order. They refuse to kill the baby boys, and the number of Hebrews in Egypt continues to grow. But their intervention does not put an end to the enslavement of the Hebrews, nor does it stop the king's decree. And it is into this world that Moses is born. And when our hero grows up, he too tries to intervene. He kills an Egyptian one day when he sees them being beaten by an Egyptian. But then he flees into another country when he hears, when Pharaoh finds out the news. The oppression continues. Then the king of Egypt dies. And even then, the enslavement of the Hebrews does not come to an end. It just gets worse and worse. And with no discernible way forward, they cry out for help in the midst of their oppression. And the imagery in this passage really underscores just how deep, how entrenched their suffering is. Their cry is so loud that it leaves the atmosphere, rising up into the heavens and making its way into God's throne room. And then we have the moment. The moment at which our heart rate should go through the roof. The moment at which we, as the reader, are supposed to know that the good guys are going to win and the bad guys are going to lose. This is the moment in the epic story of Exodus where we learn that the good guys have something that the bad guys just can't match. God heard their groaning. And God remembered God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God knew them. In this moment, we learn that the thing that is going to turn the tide, the thing that the good guys have that the bad guys can't match, is a God who chooses to draw near to God's people in the midst of their suffering. God hears. God remembers. God looks. And God knows. And when I say God knows, here's what I mean. For God to know the people's suffering speaks to God's experience of this suffering. God has so entered into their sufferings as to have experienced what they are having to endure. God does not remain safe in some heavenly abode untouched by the sorrows of the world. God is not portrayed here as a typical monarch dealing with the issue with subordinates or from at a distance. God does not look at the suffering from the outside as though through a window. God knows it from the inside. God enters fully into the oppressive situation and makes it God's own. God gets close enough to the Hebrews to allow their suffering to enter into God's very being. Now, rarely do we think of the moment as a moment of embracing suffering. And if you're familiar with the story of Exodus, you probably wouldn't think that this is the moment because there are so many other big time, hot shot, big power moments. The burning bush, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the giving of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. So many moments. But in the epic narrative of Exodus, this is the moment. God's choice to enter into and stand in solidarity with the suffering of the Hebrews is the catalyst for everything that God does in the rest of the story. In chapter 3, God appears to Moses in the burning bush and tells him, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians. In chapter 6, when Moses begins to lose hope that his people will see deliverance, God reminds him, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, and I have remembered my covenant. And so I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. All of the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the defeat of the Egyptians, providing manna in the wilderness, leading them towards the promised land, everything is because God hears, God remembers, God looks, and God knows. And this is a message that I think we need to hear about God today. Because the God of Exodus is the God that we worship. And that God is still doing what God did for the people of Israel. God is still hearing, remembering, looking, and knowing. And really quickly, I just want to take a moment to name something. At this point, you're probably pretty tired. You're tired of hearing about the coronavirus. You're tired of hearing how our justice system failed Breonna Taylor and so many others like her in every way it possibly could. You're tired of hearing about political polarization and Supreme Court battles and racism and police brutality and fake news and elections and all of the junk that dominates our news cycle. You're tired of online class, of the lack of human interaction, of balancing work and school and family and extracurriculars and everything else. But the reality is that all of this, whether we like it or not, is the landscape in which we find ourselves. It can be bleak and harsh and challenging, not without moments of beauty or serenity or even laughter, but still, this is not a cakewalk. This is uncharted territory. We are walking without a map. We're in the wilderness. And this is why we are spending the next 6 weeks in a series called Life in the Wilderness, reading these stories from Exodus. As your pastors, Erica and I have wrestled deeply with how to speak to this moment that we're in. And we agree that the stories we will encounter from the book of Exodus and the messages God wants to speak to us through these stories can help us make our way through the wilderness that we find ourselves in. And I think that sometimes when we are in the wilderness like we are now, sometimes we just need to know that God knows. We need to know that God hears the cries of God's people. And that when God hears them, God does not respond like Pharaoh. God does not ignore us or look upon us and think that we deserve what we've got. God is not sending us more work or more burdens to punish us. When God hears the cries of God's people, God draws near to them. God draws near to us. And as followers of Jesus, we have been grafted into the same covenant that God remembers in this text. God remembers us. God sees us. And God knows us so deeply that God has chosen to step into what we are experiencing. God chooses to make our suffering God's own suffering. God is in this with us. Now, I wish I could end this sermon by promising that God will pull some Exodus level power out of God's bag of tricks. I wish that tomorrow we'd all wake up and hear a little whisper on your left, and then the coronavirus would disappear and the election would have come and gone and the university would be back to normal and maybe Black Panther would be here. I don't know, but everything would be fine. But I can't promise that. But all I can do is remind you that God is still at work. God hears us. God remembers us. God sees us. And God knows us. God is walking through this wilderness with us. Where we're going, I don't know. But we won't be alone for the journey. Amen.